I'm going to get started. Thanks, everybody, for being here today, and good afternoon. My name's Brittany Weissman. I run the Hollywood Homeless Coalition called Hollywood Forward, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's panel discussion with the 2024 LA Lead Study authors. They are from RAND, and I welcome them warmly. I'll list them by name. We have Louis Abramson, Sarah Hunter, Jason Ward, and Rick Garvey. They will be presenting to you today, and thank you to you all for sharing your time and expertise with us today. I wanted to start out by explaining from my perspective why I think LA Leads is so important. And part of the reason it is important is because it provides a real in-depth look at the experiences, needs, and outcomes for individuals in LA who are navigating homelessness, who are navigating housing instability, and finding connection to services where they can. It doesn't just ask, where are people now, like some other surveys. It asks really more about like, where were they? Where are they going? And what factors are kind of helping or hindering that journey? And that's what makes the LA Leads findings both rigorous and actionable. Because the study is anchored in consistent methods and geographies over multiple years, LA Leads is able to produce this very rich, evidence-based window into both the short-term shifts and the longer-term trajectories for people experiencing unsheltered homelessness in LA. And unlike other kind of one-time snapshots on people experiencing homelessness, this study returns to the same 3 locations several times throughout the years, checking on who's exiting homelessness, what happens after, things like this. And it tells us what types of individuals are thriving and doing well or better. On the other side, who continues to struggle, and a little bit into the why is it that case. In this way, it's able to reveal patterns about the impact of sustained case management, the effects of temporary versus permanent supportive housing, and then a little bit on some specific barriers that keep people from achieving lasting stability, like whether or not their behavioral health needs are met or there are gaps in service coordination. And then the team here today is going to talk us through all of those things. I'd say from my seat, sitting in the population of folks working in housing and health and policy, it's really not just data. I know we're talking with RAND, but it's also a roadmap for action for our future collective work. And I have two ideas here on this action side. It's going to help us on the practice side target interventions for the greatest impact and effect. This year, there are going to be insights shared that will potentially have changes that we should consider making on the street side to meet the needs of the new population of people experiencing homelessness unsheltered in LA. And it also will inform our partners on the government and funder side about which investments may yield the best results for the longest lasting trajectories for better change. So we're always eager for its results and its release. I am always waiting with bated breath, and I'm so glad we get to bring it to you today. A few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. We're reserving time at the end of this session after all the panelists speak for Q&A, but I'll be monitoring the Q&A box or chat feature on your computer Zoom. So please type your questions into the Q&A. I'll pick them up and load them into the convo later. And then also this webinar is being recorded, and we're going to post the recording and share the slides on the RAND website as soon as possible. So that's enough for me. Thanks for having me. The insights are going to shape, like I said, what we can change on the ground, and there's no better way to dig in than for me to just hand it over to Sarah right now. Sarah, welcome.
Thanks, Brittany. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking the time today to allow us to walk you through some of the key highlights from our latest study. I'm here with my colleagues, as Brittany said, Louis Abramson, Rick Garvey, and Jason Ward to discuss the findings from our work covering 2024 and reflections from 2022 and 2023. For those of you who are less familiar with LA Leads, the study was designed to build on what we learned from the annual point-in-time count, and that we conduct counts, as Brittany said, throughout the year, and then we conduct surveys with people living unsheltered that ask questions that go beyond the demographic survey that the annual point-in-time count does. And more specifically, LA Leads focuses on 3 LA neighborhoods, Hollywood, Skid Row, and Venice, that have been historically known as hotspots for unsheltered homelessness in LA. And we selected these neighborhoods back in fall 2021. You may recall at that time, there were court orders for housing to be offered to people in Skid Row. And we thought at that time that it might result in an interesting dynamic of people moving in and out of that area if housing was offered. While that court order did not result in any major policy changes at that time, our efforts to count and survey people more frequently in these neighborhoods than once a year does allow us to study the impact of efforts to address encampments and other interim housing initiatives at a more granular level than from an annual count. Next, I'm going to turn it over to our data collection field manager, Rick Garvey, to tell you more about how we conduct these counts in the neighborhood.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do and how we do it. So generally what we do is we go out to the same areas, that's Venice, Hollywood, and Skid Row, and we do our counts of both unsheltered individuals, so just people on the sidewalk, people who are using their vehicles as a residence, and people who are using tents or makeshift shelters. We started back in 2021, 2022, doing this monthly and actually bi-weekly in Skid Row. And we have since moved to bi-monthly. So we do it once every 2 months in each of the 3 areas. We alternate the days of the week, we alternate the times of the month, and we do these counts in the evenings. So we start around 9 p.m. and we go until about 1 a.m. When we first started the project, we attempted to do some early morning counts to see if there were any differences, and we didn't find any. And just logistically, it's a lot better to do it in the evening, so that's what we do. As of today, we have done 44 visits to Skid Row, 31 to Venice, and 31 to Hollywood. So we really know the area very well. This is a sort of an overview of the area that we cover. You can see that we have a large footprint of Hollywood that is then split up into smaller areas. The way we do this is we have teams. I have different teams of interviewers who cover each area. When we finish a sub-region, so you can see 101, 102, at the end of each sub-region, we tally our numbers, and we have independent counters. So for each team, I have a lead who is the driver, and then I have 2 independent counters, and they compare their numbers, and we take an average of the 2 counts for each region. If we ever have a situation where the counts are greater than 10% off, we will recount that area. So if you can see Hollywood, we cover the area basically Franklin to the north, Melrose to the south, Vista to the west, and Vermont to the east. And that's our general footprint in Hollywood. When it comes to Skid Row, we do it all by foot. So I should have mentioned Hollywood, we drive. We drive up and down all the streets, all the alleys. For Skid Row, we walk every block, every alley of Skid Row. We again break it into subregions, and our boundaries were helped be defined by some other service providers. So a shout out to the People Concern, the Downtown Women's Center, and some other service providers in downtown LA that basically told us where we should be going. We also did our own observations to make sure that this was the correct area. And so the area that we cover in Skid Row is basically bounded by Main Street to the west, Central to the east, 3rd to the north, and 7th to the south. Venice is a little bit of a mixture. So we do cars driving in the eastern part of Venice, and we walk the boardwalk and the beach areas. So we kind of have 2 different teams. We have driving teams and we have walking teams. And for Venice, we have limited our region to the Santa Monica border to the north, Washington Boulevard to the south, so we don't include the marina or the peninsula, Wallgrove to the east, and then the ocean to the west. And we've been covering these areas, like I say, dozens and dozens of times. And I'm going to now pass over to Louis.
Thanks, Rick. So courtesy of the excellent work of Rick's team, we have these great every other month enumerations of unsheltered folks living in these 3 areas. And I think the upshot that we're going to discuss today is that for the first time, our enumerations in 2024 showed significant declines over all 3 neighborhoods collectively. That decline was not shared uniformly geographically, in that, as you can see here, it was extremely pronounced in Hollywood, which we saw almost cutting in half of its unsheltered population. Venice Beach, we saw a decline of about a quarter, but Skid Row is somewhere between statistically flat up to a slight increase. So the decline is very notable. In total, it's about 15% or about 500 people, fewer unsheltered people living on these streets. But it wasn't common to all neighborhoods, and as we'll see as we go on, it wasn't common to all of the different kinds of people who were living unsheltered. As we move forward in the slide deck, in fact, coming up right now, we'll talk a little bit about that. So how do we translate what Rick's team saw into an actual number? I think for those of you who are familiar with LASA's point in time count, our methodology will be quite familiar to you. So what an enumerator counts out there on the street are unsheltered persons, individuals who appear to be unhoused, who have no dwelling whatsoever. I'm going to refer to this category of people as rough sleepers, moving on in the talk. And then we also count dwellings which are being used for habitation. Those could be vehicles, cars, vans, or RVs. They could be tents or makeshift shelters. And we end up breaking this up slightly differently, but LASA. But effectively, our raw enumeration is of unsheltered persons, rough sleepers, and their dwellings. And this gives us a basic estimate of just the total amount of unsheltered objects or individuals on the street. We then have to move from that count to an actual population estimate, which involves upweighting all the dwellings by their average occupancy. As you can see here, there's an average of 2.3 people living per tent. You take that number, multiply it by the number of tents, and you have the total number of unsheltered people who inhabit those tents. You add that for cars and vans, RVs, and add that to the rough sleeper tally, and you get the total amount of unsheltered people in a given area. This is exactly how the point in time count is done. And when we refer to statistics going forward, we tend to refer to this methodology, which we refer to as our full multiplier methodology. Now, this is probably an overestimate, because what it assumes is that none of the rough sleepers are actually associated with any of the dwellings in our area, i.e., none of the rough sleepers may actually live in a tent that we see in the same enumeration. So we're double counting. We try to account for that by providing a second estimate, which we call our hybrid multiplier, where we simply reduce the number of rough sleepers by the fraction who, in our demographic survey, which Sarah's going to talk about later, said they actually inhabited a dwelling on over the past 30 days. This is probably a lower estimate because it assumes that 100% of the rough sleepers we saw are actually associated with a dwelling, as opposed to fundamentally rough sleeping. So while the truth is probably somewhere between these two estimates, and we show them both on the plots that we're going to go over in just a few moments here and in our report, the statistics I'm going to refer to are from the full multiplier approach, again, because it's in line with the pit count methodology. So I think it's time to now look at the trends. Starting with Hollywood, which was the neighborhood where both demographically and in terms of counts, we saw the most evolution across 2024. So you're going to see a couple of plots that look like this over the next few slides. And what it's showing in black is the full multiplier estimate of the total number of unsheltered people living in that geography that Rick showed you, which we call Hollywood. The purple estimate is using our hybrid methodology, which again just accounts for the fact that some rough sleepers may actually inhabit a dwelling. So as you can see, this trend peaked somewhere in the summer of 2023 and has been declining steadily thereafter, such that by the end of last year, by December of last year, Hollywood's unsheltered population was at an all-time low, according to our study. If you just count December 2023 to December 2024, again, it fell by about half. We started the year at around 1,000 unsheltered people in Hollywood and ended at around 500. The gray vertical lines here, the natural question might be, why did this happen? And while we don't do a full causal analysis, overplotted here as gray vertical dashed lines are all of the inside safe activities that the LA CAO records as having moved at least 25 people into interim housing. And as you can see, there's significant overlap between that activity and the reduction of unsheltered homelessness in Hollywood. So This decline is marked. If you go forward one slide, Sarah, when you look at it and just in terms of year by year, it is also pretty much limited to 2024. I'm just showing the same thing that I did on the last slide here, but each horizontal dashed line is the trend for each year. And you can see year on year, it's been flat until 2024, where we see this steep decline, which may trace back a little bit further, such that over the entire time span, that solid gray line, we've seen a net reduction in Hollywood. And again, this was coincident with Inside Safe activities. Inside Safe is the city's process of moving folks from tent encampments into motel rooms. And the decline we're seeing here is almost entirely driven by a reduction in tent dwelling. So tent dwelling in Hollywood fell by 90% last year, which is responsible for most of this decline and corresponds almost exactly to the number of people Inside Safe moved indoors, which we think is a pretty strong causal link there, although we can't say for sure. Moving to Skid Row, we don't see the same trends here. So again, looking at the full multiplier, the black line, 2024 does not show a drop in unsheltered homelessness in Skid Row. In fact, depending on how you count, there might have been as much as a 9% increase. That doesn't mean that the population didn't turn over. Sarah's going to talk about changes in the population there that suggest there was flow through Skid Row, throughput through Skid Row, but certainly it was not, the outflow was not sufficient to beat any inflow moving into that neighborhood. And I think this is reinforced if you advance just by looking on its year-to-year trends. Skid Row throughout our entire study period is unique in that it has never shown a decline, and we see this durable flat to slight increase over the entire time baseline and also in 2024. Finally, looking to Venice, Venice shares with Hollywood, again, this pronounced decline in 2024 using either the full or hybrid multiplier, but its cause was much different. Venice has been pretty much devoid of tents, or has had a very low number of tents since a major Inside Safe action in January 2023, which again is overplotted as one of the gray lines here. So instead, its decline mainly reflects a drop in the number of vehicle dwellers, cars, vans, and RVs. That number fell substantially in Venice last year, which led to basically a 25% total decline. We don't exactly know what generated this. The tall black lines here are other city actions that have taken place over the years that are not Inside Safe, but may affect the Venice population. In 2024, not exactly in our survey footprint, but near, there were RV resolutions, and there is anecdotal evidence of many folks in vehicles being approached and asked to relocate from a new study coming out of UCLA team earlier this year. But we don't have enough information to really decipher a causal mechanism there, other than to say that the decline was really limited to vehicle dwellers. And again, just looking at it year by year, Venice's decline is really driven in 2024. We've seen stable-ish counts between 800 and 900 folks per enumeration until last year, where it's really fallen significantly. Looking at the entire footprint as a whole, which I think is very edifying, reveals a little bit more about what I was saying in the beginning about this decline not being shared equally amongst the different types of people living unsheltered. So what you're seeing on the left here is the entire unsheltered population using the full multiplier estimate that we think across all three neighborhoods was true for the entire study period. Below that are the counts for people living in tents, which is in green, people living in vehicles, which is in blue, and people who are rough sleeping, i.e. unsheltered people with no dwelling at all. And those trends are overplotted again for the entire study period. And what you can see is that the only population that has exhibited a durable decline there, the only population where the trend line is pointing down, are tents and makeshift dwellers, which really means this overall decline we saw in unsheltered homelessness in Leeds last year has been powered by that subpopulation specifically. When you look at vehicle dwellers, it's flat across our entire study timeline. And when you look at rough sleepers, most concerningly, it's rising. To the point now where if you look on the right-hand side, which simply recasts these trends as fractions of the total population, you can see at the end of the plot on the right there, that the orange line is now the tallest line. This means now that the typical modal unsheltered person in the Leeds footprint is a rough sleeper, i.e. is living on the street with no dwellings at all. You can see the marked decline in tent dwelling there, and a sort of slower rise of vehicle dwelling as well. So this, I think, is gonna give some context to the survey results Sarah's going to talk through, which is starting to show this decoupling of the numbers of people on the street, which are going down, and the needs of the people still on the street, which are going up. Obviously, rough sleepers have some of the highest needs that we know of, both socially and clinically, given that they're very exposed and tend to be the most isolated. So we think this transition from an encampment-based to a rough sleeping-based unsheltered population has pretty major implications for policy going forward, which we can discuss at the end. One final note. So we tend to conduct our surveys every year. We tend to have one that falls pretty close to the annual point in time count. And when you compare apples to apples, when you look at the point in time counts in the same geographies that we examine within 1 month of each other, which are all of the, our nearest enumeration to the pit, for 2022 and 2023, our estimates agree pretty well. In fact, in 2023, they agree almost to statistical precision, which is I'll explain this slide in a second, but that means that the difference between our enumerations and the official PIT statistics are basically just random errors. We saw something different in 2024, which was a significant underestimate in the PIT count compared to our Leeds enumerations. And that's what's plotted here. On the x-axis is our value for the number of unsheltered, actually just the raw enumeration, just the number of vehicles, tents, and rough sleepers in our geography. And on the y-axis is the PIT result. So any points below the diagonal line, which is 1 to 1, an equal number counted by either us or the PIT teams, any point below that suggests an official undercount in the PIT statistics versus ours. And you can see that for all 3 neighborhoods and for almost all of the different kinds of unsheltered modalities in the different point shapes and colors here, the points lie below the line, such that in total, the PIT result reflects only about 2/3 of the total number of people or dwellings that we enumerated in 2024. And I think this just feeds into ongoing discussions about the PIT and how to make sure it's the most accurate enumeration we can have, given how much depends on it. And we don't know yet what this looks like for 2025. We're working on that. But I think going forward, these cross checks, which we do internally, will be valuable to ensuring that the PIT is as robust an estimate as we possibly can have. So takeaways, again, most importantly, unsheltered homelessness did fall for the first time across our study area in total by about 500 people, or 15%. This was driven most significantly by an almost 50% reduction in Hollywood, about half that fractional reduction in Venice, but Skid Row did not see a decline. As this decline has occurred, it's really been limited to tents and vehicle dwellers, such that now rough sleeping is the most typical way that people are living unsheltered in the Leeds study area, and it has not seen a decline in any study area last year. So it is a persistent and now the dominant type of unsheltered living. I think further investigating how our work relates to the PIT count is important, and hopefully will lead to ways to make sure we have the most precise and accurate enumerations we can going forward. So that's it from me for now. I will hand it back to Rick and Sarah to talk about the survey.
Thanks, Lee. I'm going to talk quickly about our approach when we do the surveys. So we do a random sampling in Skid Row, where we go out onto the streets and we approach every 3rd person that we encounter. So no matter who they are, no matter where they are, if the clicker says number 3, that's who we approach. The first couple of years in Hollywood and Venice, there were enough people on the streets that we were able to do an every other count person. So we would click yes, click no, click yes, click no. In 2024, however, the numbers were reduced enough that we were able to approach everybody for the survey. So there was no sampling in Venice or Hollywood this year. We just approached everybody that we saw. The survey itself is paper and pencil. You can see a nice picture of Lisa, my interviewer there. And it takes about 15 to 20 minutes to do. And we asked a bunch of different questions that Sarah will give you some more details on. But the survey, we pay $10 in cash. And again, it takes about 15 or 20 minutes for each person to do each survey. Sarah, why don't you tell us more?
I think you're going to walk us through the response rates, Rick.
Oh, okay, perfect. So you can see that we approached almost 700 people, and we had a non-response rate of about 16%. So those are people who either refused to be screened or were cognitively unable to be screened or did not speak English. And we're actually going to add Spanish, I think, for this coming year, but for this particular year, we only did English. So we ended up being able to screen 541 people. They had to have been unsheltered in the past 30 days. So if they had indicated that they were living in a apartment or a hotel room, they were not eligible for the study. So we ended up with 472 people who participated, 463 who actually made it through the whole survey. And so our final sample size was 463 this year.
Yeah, and this was a doubling of the sample size in the previous year. So that was another reason why we targeted or approached every single person on the street in Hollywood and Venice, rather than that skip approach we had previously used. Now I'm going to just walk you through some key highlights from the survey. We're now swimming in data now that we've conducted this 3 years in a row. So if you go to the annex in our report, you can see, you can compare across neighborhoods, or you can compare within a neighborhood across time, and pretty much every single variable in our survey. So again, I can't go over all of that in today's presentation, but it's there if you're curious about something in particular. Okay, so just talking about key trends across all three areas. One thing that Louis noted earlier was about how the population potentially has been changing, even though, like in Skid Row, we're seeing the same number of people out there. And these data suggest that's certainly happening. When we started this effort back in 2021, people are telling us, at least 3/4 of the people are telling us they had been out there for 3 years or longer. That has shifted quite a bit to around about half our sample of being out on the streets 3 years or longer. We also asked, we didn't ask this question the first year, but last year we added a question about whether people had been forced to move in the past year. So we just have 2 years of data on this, and you'll see it's relatively high. Most people said, like, since they've been homelessness in LA, nearly 80% of people told us, yes, they've been forced to move. And that was a little higher. We saw an uptick in Venice relative to the other neighborhoods. Now I'm going to go through some just key highlights from each of the different neighborhoods, starting with Hollywood. And this, remember, we saw a drop of about 50% of the number of people we were observing living unsheltered on the street across the year. And we're also seeing that the population characteristics are changing quite a bit. So we saw a drop in the number of people who were Black on the streets. So instead of half the population being Black that we surveyed, now half the population is white. So that does suggest this is really a different population living out there than previously. And these other data also point to that fact that we're seeing people reporting that they're less well. We're seeing people tell us they're more likely to be receiving SSDI or SSI, so Social Security disability, than in the previous year. People are reporting they have more income potentially related to receiving disability income. And people are also telling us they're more likely they spent at least one night in jail or prison in the past year than in our prior survey. People are also telling us that they've had less, resources provided to them than previously. So last year, Hollywood was kind of like the top in terms of survey response telling us that they have been offered these different services, like they've been assessed for housing needs, they've had help obtaining documents, they've received some sort of harm reduction supplies or safe sex supplies, and they've been offered at least temporary group shelter. And that reduced quite a bit among our respondents in 2024. Next, turning to Skid Row. Again, this is the largest population that we survey. And in general, I'm going to show you comparisons to the other neighborhoods. Participants in Skid Row tend to be older. They have a higher number of women living on the streets in Skid Row. And, you know, more than half the population is Black African American. The population in Skid Row is also tells us that they're sicker. They have higher rates of a self-reported mental health condition, substance use disorder, and physical health condition. Now turning to Venice, this is kind of what I would say highest functioning population that we survey. They tend to tell us they have more education, they're receiving more financial resources. In fact, 1 in 5 tell us that they're employed, and they're more likely to have a working cell phone, and 1/4 of them tell us they have a driver's license. The Venice participants also report having higher incomes. The 50 percentile is around $500. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Jason to tell you more about our findings related to some questions we asked about receiving offers of shelter or housing.
Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, I'm gonna talk you just through some of these results that have to do with offers of shelter housing, and then kind of some additional explorations we're going to do related to this question. So this figure shows the distribution of respondents reporting the number of times they were offered shelter or housing in the past year. Around 2/3 of respondents reported receiving 1 or more such offers, as you can see here. But nearly 1/3 reported never receiving any offers in the past year. However, with all this analysis I'm going to discuss here, it's important to note that there's a meaningful role for selection effects in this type of analysis. So specifically, we would think that many people receive offers and were successfully sheltered or housed over time. So we should have these people kind of in our mental accounting as having received an offer, which would increase the proportion of people having received an offer if we could then observe the people that did receive an offer and were successfully housed. We only observe the people who report receiving offers and for various reasons are still on the streets. So these results, along with the caveat I just outlined there, suggest that offers of shelter or housing are relatively common. Next slide, please. For the last couple of years, we've also attempted to use some basic regression modeling to understand what kind of associations there are between the socio-demographic characteristics of our respondents and receiving these kinds of offers of shelter or housing. We looked at 4 specific sets of characteristics from our survey data to do this: age, race and ethnicity, self-reported health, and diagnosed health conditions. And then I'm going to discuss here each one of these in turn, and I'm going to talk about the role of this kind of selection issue that I just mentioned. So with respect to age, we found that on average, older respondents received slightly more offers of housing or shelter, but these differences were not statistically meaningful, which is similar to what we found in 2023 with the same kind of analysis. Now, if we think older adults are, you can stay on this slide for a moment, please, thanks. If older adults, we think on average are of higher acuity, at face value, this would suggest they're not receiving as many offers as perhaps they should based on acuity. But again, the selection issue suggests that if higher acuity older adults are also more likely to receive and accept offers and stay off the streets, then this could be a sign of a well-functioning acuity-based system, namely that there are fewer older respondents remaining on the streets to receive offers. This interpretation is somewhat consistent with the modest declines in older respondents we note in Skid Row and Hollywood over time, though I'll also mention that most of that change occurred between our last couple survey intervals between 2022 and 2023. Next slide, please, here. So in terms of race and ethnicity, what we did for power reasons just kind of grouped all people who reported some racial identity other than white as non-white respondents. These respondents in the survey reported receiving a slightly higher mean level of offers of shelter or housing, but we didn't find any statistically significant differences there between either self-reported race or between Hispanic ethnicity. Now, this is in contrast to 2023, when we did find that non-white respondents received roughly twice as many offers of shelter or housing as white respondents. But here again, the idea of selection playing a role is plausible. We noted that there was a large decline in Black respondents in Hollywood, and we also saw modest declines in the number of Black respondents in Skid Row and Hollywood, or really the shares in Skid Row as well, sorry. So this demographic change could be driving this non-funding on race versus what we found last year, though I'll note that this isn't consistent with the story for not finding anything with Hispanic respondents, because we've seen a large increase in the share of Hispanic respondents in Skid Row. Next slide, please. So these are results for self-reported health. Here we see some mixed evidence. The reference group in this analysis, just for sort of your own interpretation, is those self-reporting excellent health, who received an average of around 1.35 offers of housing over the past year, housing or shelter, sorry, to be consistent. Relative to this group, those who reported their health as very good or good received statistically significantly more offers of housing or shelter, but there was no statistical significant differences for those reporting fair or poor health. We had noted also that there was a meaningful increase in the share of those reporting fair health as sort of a sign of like a modest deterioration in the average level of self-reported health. So again, the same kind of selection effects may be at work here, but the appropriate interpretation of this pattern isn't super clear from this analysis alone. Next slide, please. And then relatedly, and finally, we considered the reporting of 3 specific conditions that are often closely related to experiencing chronic homelessness. These are having a chronic or long-term substance use disorder, having a chronic or long-term mental health condition, and having a chronic or long-term physical health condition, as well as the co-occurrence of all 3 of these states, or so-called trimorbidity. When we considered these separately, we didn't find a statistically meaningful relationship between substance use disorders or physical health conditions in these offers of shelter or housing. But we did find that those reporting a chronic mental health condition received roughly 30% more such offers. When we looked at trimorbidity, we found a substantially higher association with receiving these kinds of offers, roughly 60% more for those in this category. Here, the role of selection, I think, is really important to consider carefully. So if we think, for example, that those with chronic physical health conditions may be more amenable to accepting offers of shelter or housing, then the lack of a positive association here makes sense, similar to the previous discussion of age. If, on the other hand, we think those with chronic mental health conditions or substance use disorders may be less likely to accept such offers due to, and this is especially true, I think, in the case of mental health conditions, barriers to establishing trust or maintaining a consistent stream of contacts that might be necessary to move someone indoors, then the higher level of offers may be a more straightforward sign of using acuity to allocate offers. The result for trimorbidity, I think, is also broadly consistent with this if those kinds of co-occurring disorders are sort of dominate the difficulty of building relationships to successfully get people housed. So that's just kind of trying to get under the hood a little bit of some of these patterns we see in the data. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Louis, I believe, to conclude. Thanks.
Okay, great. So yeah, I think our report has 2 overarching take homes, which reflect the dynamics that we think are, or in one case we observe, and in one case we think are underlying the trends that we've just discussed. So first has to do with continuing to prioritize and streamline permanent housing. The county, writ large, looking at the county collectively, about 26% more people were placed into permanent housing in the fiscal year that overlaps the first half of the data we've talked about. We think it's pretty likely that a bunch of folks from interim housing moved into those new beds some of which reflect, like, I think the largest tranche of Proposition HHH units opening up, which opened up beds in turn in interim housing for folks to come in to off the street. So what this means is that creating those endpoints, creating those permanent housing endpoints, which are, what we all want to make sure everybody ultimately has. The more we do that, the more throughput will be enabled from the street to sheltered settings at least. So one of our recommendations is to make sure, if you want to see durable, like if the gains that we have found last year are to continue durably into the future, I don't think this is saying anything that anybody on this call doesn't know, but continuing to rapidly build permanent supportive housing assets is critical. And the last recommendation has to do with this switch that I discussed between an encamped population and one that's mainly comprised or increasingly comprised of rough sleepers. And it has to do with adjusting our outreach and engagement strategies to welcome or to invite or to engage this new population into the system. I just want to elaborate before I actually explain the recommendation. I want to explain the challenges here. So this switch from a tent encampment population in urban Los Angeles, which we study, towards rough sleeping has tactical, strategic, and clinical implications. The tactical implication is pretty much the easiest one to see. If you're an outreach worker, it's increasingly difficult for you to approach an encampment and engage like 10 people at once. Those 10 people are now rough sleeping and therefore spread out over a larger geography, which means as an outreach worker, the face of the system, your job becomes much less efficient. You have to roam a larger area now to encounter the same number of people and, get them into HMIS and bring them into the system. So that's a tactical challenge that the system now faces due to this dynamic. The strategic challenge is simply that a encampment-based engagement strategy becomes less effective by definition as there are fewer and fewer encampments. For example, in Hollywood and also in Venice, tent encampments have been effectively eliminated. So encampment resolution strategies no longer have targets, and therefore other kinds of strategic approaches will simply be necessary because the environment is no longer amenable to encampment resolutions. And that will become increasingly true in more areas as they become increasingly, as they bring more people into interim housing. The clinical challenges, though, have to do with what Sarah was saying. Rough sleepers tend to be the most socially isolated. As I said earlier, they're obviously exposed to the elements the most, and therefore may have the steepest just medical and other challenges. So the average case is going to become tougher. This is this kind of strain that the system, I think, will start to see and will have to adapt itself to address if it wants to make sure that the trends, the reductions in unsheltered homelessness we found, extend durably and equitably into the future. What is the engagement to start this ball rolling? I think it comes down to that first contact between an outreach worker and someone on the street. One of the predicates of Inside Safe is that the social bonds that people form in their encampments are important to improved interim housing outcomes, which is why the encampment tends to be moved together. Rough sleepers don't have those social bonds, so they're going to have to be formed with some other entity, and that person may well have to be the outreach team. So multidisciplinary outreach teams, as they prioritize rough sleepers, will have to focus on trust and relationship building in addition to the offering of a housing asset, because some of that social infrastructure that they could leverage when they were engaging in encampments will no longer be there. That's the sort of philosophical challenge. Of course, there are going to be technical challenges too. As Sarah said, rough sleepers aren't just the most vulnerable, they're the most mobile, they're the most dynamic. We're seeing people spending less time in the same place, which means a person-centric approach is going to require coordination over larger geographies between more outreach teams to engage the same person and maintain those trusting relationships that can be leveraged to bring them indoors. This may, of course, entail improved communications and data sharing practices. I know these have been topics of concern for a long time, but simply I want to connect the finding that we're seeing of this mode switch, this demographic switch, and I mean that from a just unsheltered modality frame, that's going to stress the system in new ways beyond those that it had to overcome last year to achieve the success it did. And I think that's probably it from me. Yes, otherwise, just I personally want to thank everybody for joining this call, and I want to thank my teammates here for being such brilliant co-authors. And I think we'll turn it over to Brittany now to manage the rest of the Q&A.
Fabulous, and thank you all. Each of you did a fabulous job with the overview of the content. We have a lot of good conversation in the Q&A chat box. I'd also say that I think it's clear we're all clocking this change in the type of mode that people are experiencing homelessness. It sounds like rough sleeping is really the name of the new mode, and a lot of folks are trying to understand the offers of housing and the detail around that. And then if rough sleeping was more predominant for one of the three locations than all three at the same time. But let me kind of pull up the lens a little bit. It sounds like we're at an inflection point, and the type of way people are experiencing homelessness is changing. At the same time, we have even newer federal and state and kind of local policies and funding shifts. And so can you give us a preview of what you're experiencing now in 2025, given that this is looking at 2024? What is Skid Row today? What are you finding? What is out and about in town?
Yeah, I'll start with that one. So we have seen some changes in Skid Row. There have been several really large permanent supportive housing buildings that have gone up. So for example, Crocker used to be sort of ground zero for tents and encampments on Skid Row, the corner of 5th and Crocker. That is no longer the case because they have built a really large new facility that includes a drop-in center and permanent supportive housing on Crocker. They have also started doing some construction work along 5th Street. So part of that area that used to be literally ground zero has been cleared. However, the numbers haven't changed. So they're just being moved around to other parts of Skid Row. We are still seeing incredible amounts of tents and encampments in Skid Row compared to the other sites. And the other thing I want to mention about Skid Row that we've seen recently in our last 2 visits is a larger influx of Hispanic and Spanish-speaking families. So my guess is it is in a result of some of the ICE activity. Our last Skid Row count was 2 days after the MacArthur Park action that happened with ICE in MacArthur Park. And for the first time in the 5 years I've been doing this, regular counts on Skid Row, we started seeing clotheslines set up from RVs to tents with children's clothing hanging on the clotheslines. We've started to see more babies in mom's arms, sort of next to RVs and next to cars. That is very markedly different than we've seen in previous years. I'll start with that.
Okay, well, it makes it very critical that this study continues, and we'll talk a little bit about your plans for that when we close out this session. Another question is around the difference, if any, between the PIT data and the results out of the LASA PIT count, and then also your count. So some people, there's been a lot of articles, and some people in the chat box are wondering, what do we make of the difference, if any, and what's the best and highest use of the LA Leads study data? I know we kind of closed on that in the formal presentation.
I can speak to some of this. I mean, okay, I have come, so I think about this a lot. I'm the one that has my head in the numbers, and this sort of reflects a little topic of discussion we had at USC's Homeless Policy Research Institute a couple of weeks ago. I've come to think about the PIT counts utility in sort of 2 distinct ways. There is the total number, and there is the breakdown by modality. I can say that the fraction of people that we see living in the different modalities reflects the official PIT count data quite well. So when it comes to determining what is the dominant mode of unsheltered homelessness in these areas, and how does that rank order against the other ones, I think the 2 data sets are telling a very similar story. That's important because that has all the strategic implications I said. Like if you now know, for example, you see vehicular homelessness as the dominant mode in some area, which I think you could assess robustly using either our data or the LASA data. That means you need to prioritize vehicle-based strategies, et cetera. Then there's the absolute number. And the absolute number is where we saw that gap in 2024. And again, we didn't see the same gap in 2023 or 2022. I think what is that number supposed to do? That's supposed to tell you the total amount of resources that the system has to dedicate to this population. And there, I think the discussion has to be much more nuanced. I mean, it's always been known, it's very difficult to count people. And I think that there's a long the Economic Roundtable used to publish all sorts of best practices we could import from New York in terms of like identifying false positive and false negatives. That can be tuned, but I think you have to, that number is only interesting with respect to a resource amount, right? If I count 40,000 or 44,000 of people who need, for example, substance use treatment, and I have 5 substance use beds, that delta in the top line number isn't actionable. So I do think that we should dive into the, I would propose to the county that you deploy secondary teams, perhaps, experts like Rick's, to do a cross-check count in a certain number of census tracts and calibrate the official statistics on the same night as the pit. That would be a good cross-check and a good way to sort of measure these, offsets. But the offset itself, I'm less worried about until it starts to touch the actual resources that we have allocated. And right now, the numbers are so much beyond that, that I think it's an important question to tackle, but not one that leads to actionable results, unlike the fraction breakdown where the 2 counts agree. So that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. Moving us on to kind of the trajectory here. So we're noticing that there's a decrease in unsheltered homelessness, fewer people experiencing homelessness unsheltered. However, where are they going? A lot of the questions are asking about, could you speak to the criminal justice system? Are people justice involved? Did they land in jail? Did they move from one of your 3 locations to another of your 3 locations? Where are they going if they're not unsheltered?
Sarah, did you want to speak a little bit to the justice involved statistic?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a slight uptick in the number of people who are telling us that they've had at least, 1 night in jail or prison in the past year. But yeah, we don't, because we just do the survey once a year and it's not with the same population, it's just whoever is unsheltered on the streets during that time. We don't have good like longitudinal information of where they're going. We've expanded our survey areas in both Venice and Hollywood, knowing that people are getting forced to move, like maybe to the other side of Lincoln Boulevard in Venice, or maybe to the east in Hollywood, to try to capture this dynamic change. But unfortunately, we don't have the resources to kind of go beyond that. We know, for example, in Venice, a lot of people are pushed south into Del Rey, the Marina, and Westchester. But at this time, we don't have the resources to survey and count those areas as well.
Thank you, Sarah.
I also think it's worth mentioning 6 to 7 people a day are passing away on the streets, right? So if the answer of where they're going, a fair number of them are going to the coroner.
Yeah. Yeah, there are many factors that could make the count drop. The one place where we have really robust evidence that it was a specific policy is Hollywood with Inside Safe, where those numbers align quite closely. I think yes, people leaving the area to adjacent areas is something we can get a handle on by using comparisons to the pit, for example. And then the mortality statistics, if you use the 2023 ones, do amount to perhaps as many as 140 people in our survey area, which is sizable. But we again have no internal cross-check on that number.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for bringing up mortality. Okay, so another question from the Q&A box is about the policy shifts at the federal level and moving away potentially from housing first and maybe funding less of the supportive services. Any thoughts on how we're going to adjust to this policy change and what numbers may look like? I mean, we've already got a clue about Skid Row in your anecdotes, Rick.
I think, it's too early to say. I think a bright spot is Los Angeles actually relies heavily on local, like city and county and state funding to support the homeless services. And we just, honestly, last November voted and passed a measure that will double the amount of tax dollars that are going to address homelessness in Los Angeles County. So I think, yes, the federal dollars are important, but it's also to keep in mind that we have closer to home resources that will assist us. I think it's important because if you think about the investments we made back in 2016 and 17 with passing Measure H and Proposition HHH that helped to funnel attention to building permanent supportive housing and providing homeless services, we're just, I think, realizing the benefit from those policies. And so if we take our foot off the gas, we may see the numbers go up and not continue to stay steady or go down. And keep in mind, we're talking about, close to 75,000 people are still on the streets today in Los Angeles. I think at least all of us on this call probably think that's an unacceptable number, a size of a mid-sized city. So we need to perhaps celebrate the small wins, but keep in mind we have a long way to go.
Thank you, Sarah. The first question that came in is about not just harm reduction, but actual hygiene, about the location of assets like toilets on the street for people experiencing homelessness. Can you speak to the benefit or the impact of any of that in your research?
I wish we had more. When we're doing surveys in Venice, there's only one bathroom that's open 24 hours on the beach. All the other bathrooms are locked. There are no bathrooms outside of the beach in Venice. There are a few on Skid Row, not as many as there were. Actually, they just took one away on the corner of 5th and Crocker to make room for this construction. And in Hollywood, I'm not aware of any public 24-hour bathrooms. So I think that's a big issue.
It's an apropos question because we're hoping to add it to our enumeration for this. We're hoping to add exactly that question. Where do you access these facilities? Because it's been top of mind for us as well to our questionnaire for this year.
Thank you. If you're taking questions for next year, there's also quite a bit of chatter about reasons for declining housing when it's offered. Folks would love to know. And I know we're at 2 minutes too. We may just have time for just one final question, which is really like, where does this leave us? You have completed data analysis for 2024. We're experiencing the shift, the change in temperature and climate for 2025 already. What does LA Leads look like going forward?
Sure, I'll take that question. So we're just gearing up to do our survey for 2025. So yeah, we wanted to hear from all of you today in case we need to make any tweaks to our survey or ask about something different. Like Rick said, one thing we're going to do this year is put a Spanish interviewer on the street because we're observing that there's likely going to be more people on the street that might be Spanish only speakers. So we're doing that. But honestly, we don't know whether we will have the resources to continue this effort in 2026. So we are actively seeking support to continue LA Leads.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll be optimistic, and I'll also share all of the Q&A with the panelists for anybody who popped a question or comment into there. I'll be sure that it gets in front of them. And with that, I think we're a wrap. Thank you so much to Louie and to Jason and to Sarah and Rick for pulling the study together and presenting it so clearly and deeply. I think we're all better off for understanding what we're dealing with here and what we've seen in the past year. Thank you for joining us, for everybody at home and at work and in the field, and let's all keep on keeping on. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Brittany.
Thanks, Brittany, to you for helping out. Yeah.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everyone.